welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, where we take a deeper look at the weekend's passage or topic of focus, ask questions, talk about things that just there weren't time to talk about or go into in the sermon. My name is Brad, and I'm joined this week by Dan Borth. How you doing, Dan?
Yo, doing good.
It's been a minute.
Yeah, I got to let some other people take a turn in the deep dive, and it's good to be back. Thanks for tuning in.
Yes, we've been in a format where we've been using just two people, which has been really helpful for me as I, just different added responsibilities, and editing, even when there's three voices, takes like 4 times as long as editing when there's only 2 voices. So It's just kind of a weird exponential thing that it does there. But it's also been, even as for the listener, you probably hear this when there's a conversation happening between 3 people. Often what ends up happening is it's almost like me interviewing 2 different people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then when there's 2 people, it's a better conversation.
Just kind of rolls. Yeah.
Right. And so I think there's a place for both, depending on the topic or depending on the week moving forward. We'll probably play with different different arrangements, but at least over the next few weeks, as we're in a new series on the New Testament letter of Jude, it'll probably be the 2 of us doing these conversations because, Dan, you wrote the series.
Yeah, that's actually been a really big highlight of this early spring. This would be the first sermon series I've written for Calvary, and this came out of actually a paper I wrote in seminary, which sounds more nerdy than it needs to. I got to study the last, it was like verses 17 through 23, studied the original Greek and some of the interesting things there. So I just kind of fell in love with this letter and told myself the next chance I got to help others know what's here, that I'd take it. So here we are.
Cool. Yeah, it's funny how those different projects in seminary and in Bible college end up coming back to play. I'm teaching a class. It's not a plug because the class is already going, although if you do want to join it, we will always say yes, on apologetics and looking specifically at Genesis chapters 1 through 4. And one of the resources I'm using is a commentary written by one of our Old Testament professors from Covenant. And so that kind of got nice. my wheels turning. I'm also in a different class with him right now. And even the classes on apologetics. And so the approach that we take is one that I'm familiar with mainly because of my time at Covenant. And so those moments, they are shaping, and it's often when you're in your classes, especially at Covenant, I heard this on a couple different professors say, you are not the end of your education.
Yeah.
And so it's cool to see that actually be true in different moments, things like this. So New Testament letter of Jude, you wrote a paper on it. And so what do you got for us today?
Well, we're going to, what we're not getting to in our sermons is really focusing on verses 3 through 16 in the letter that deal mostly with Jude's concern for writing, his warning against the false teachers. We're focusing on the end because he gives some very clear, very affirming, very directional instructions. He talks about how to keep yourself in the love of God. He talks about what to do with those who are kind of drawn away by false teaching a little bit, how to be merciful and to rescue and to still keep separate. And then where we started yesterday and where Jude ends is the idea that ultimately it's Jesus who keeps us. So any act of faithfulness is it's like this perpetuation of his faithfulness. And any act of moving away from Christ's faithfulness results in lesser things. So all of that leads me to, you've got a great definition for good news. Gospel means good news. In your words, how would you describe what is the good news of Jesus?
Yeah, no, thank you for teeing that up. That's actually my starting question for class tomorrow night.
Sweet.
This question of, so often, what is it that Monty Python, right, on the whole, Holy Grail, I don't think that you know what that word or that word doesn't mean what you think that it means.
Oh, that's a Princess Bride.
Oh, Princess Bride, duh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
You keep using that word.
Yes, you keep using that word. And we do that with gospel, right?
Yeah, we do.
That's one of those words that we use it all the time. If you look at the Christianity, if you look at the church, like, oh, we have a gospel-centered youth ministry, gospel-centered preaching, gospel-centered. And yet I will ask people, hey, when you say the word gospel, what is that? Like, what does that mean? And often I get all of these different definitions. Well, the gospel is the Bible. The gospel's the first 4 books of the New Testament. The gospel is that God loves me. I mean, there's just all these different and all of those things I would say are versions, they're true, right, things, but they're not like the thing. And so at least where I'm at right now, right, gospel, evangelion, you see that in the New Testament. It's one of those words that Paul took. He hijacked it. He gave it new meaning because it had a very particular meaning in that culture. When Rome would be successful in battle, they would send these heralds all over the empire, proclaiming that good news, gospel. And so Paul took this thing, and he's like, hey, let's hijack it. Let's give it new meaning. Let's give it new definition. And so the gospel, right, is a speech act. It's a proclamation of victory. It's a proclamation that Jesus is king, and that is the good news. And so it's good news for the cosmos. It's good news for the world. It's good news for those for whom it's good news. But that's the thing with good news. There's always a subjective nature to good news. And so when we talk about the gospel, it's that. It's the good news is that God is active, that God is doing something in the world, that he is working to redeem all things. And this moment in history, that Jesus went to the cross and then was resurrected from the grave, like that is the good news by which we proclaim to the world. So what is the gospel? The gospel is the proclamation of the good news that Jesus is king and he reigns. Yeah.
And I think we see Jude demonstrate an awareness of. I really like how you talk about that, the proclamation of victory, the message to be sent out that something remarkable needs to be known. And so Jude starts, interestingly, Jude, half-brother of Jesus, he introduces himself as a servant of Jesus and a brother of James, which I think, based on, he's writing, I think, as a leader in the church to a degree. It makes sense, right? But wouldn't you just say, this is Jude, Jesus' brother?
So James he has a very prominent role in early Christianity. He leads the church in Jerusalem. He is known, right? And so I do think that Jude is playing a little bit on the authority of his brother there, James. But it's an interesting question but
why not his other brother?
So James does the same thing.
That's right.
In his letter. He doesn't say, it's like, why? Why would he not, wouldn't that be the greatest source of authority? And I don't know. I don't know. There's probably things that are going on that we're just not aware of, in that space. But I also think it means, it talks a little bit about identity, right? If your identity's in the group and Jesus is no longer part of the group, you're forming your identity and your authority and credibility based on somebody who very much is known and is associated with the group. But also, they weren't walking with Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
They became believers, as far as we know, after the resurrection and ascension. Yeah.
So maybe a claim on the authority of a familial relation, when you guys were brothers, you didn't even...
Well,
I don't know.
I think that's true. I do think I actually would say it looks like the authority is flipped, because when they say a servant of Jesus, that's pretty consistent. Paul introduces himself in similar phrasing. And so I wonder if there's some social equity by being the brother of James, but in terms of the authority to speak into the experience of good news, that's on Jesus. And so, but we're never authorities on Jesus on par with him. We're always in service to him. And so I think that's how I would parse that out a little bit. So he leans in to those who are called, beloved in God the Father and kept for Jesus Christ. May mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you.
Which this word kept, right? It shows up in the first verse.
That's right.
And it also shows up in the doxology at the end.
To him who is able to keep us.
Yeah, like it bookends. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's one of his very clear instructions. Keep yourselves in the love of God. He, that's key. That's a big idea. Although I was eager to write you, beloved, about our common salvation, so I think that's where the good news first shows up. I found it necessary to write, appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. So to get into the text that deals with the false teachers, my question becomes, what's the difference between good news and fake news? And
this isn't a political talk or a discussion on media.
But I do think we have become so aware of how much comes into our screens, into our ears, that has been shaped by somebody trying to not really even bother with what's the best news. They're trying to get their point across. They're trying to validate themselves. They're trying to garner a following. And so with no conversation, leaning into the political sphere, the idea of fake news actually resonates with me, because what Jude's about to say is there's people among you, among his friends, that are close enough to know the good news, but what they're actually doing is propagating fake news. Yeah. What they're advocating for, what they're choosing to do with their lives and their energy and their time and their resources is the opposite of Jesus as King. It actually looks more like the same before Jesus never came, but they're, I would imagine they're borrowing the social sphere of their church community, basically to manipulate. There's a lot of talk about sensuality and sexuality, and to do the things that the people of the good news choose not to, because they live a certain ethic. Bible Project has a really interesting sketch of Jude, and one of the points they make that I think we need to capture today is that the good news of Jesus leads to a kind of people who live according to the good news. And Jude's biggest concern here isn't that they're teaching something that may not be like the words on the page are definitionally true or untrue. They're living something that's definitionally untrue. They're living something that doesn't happen if the good news of Jesus is actually real. Yeah. And so that's Jude's concern, is to say, no, the common salvation we share, it has a particular effect on us. This isn't about mistakes and slip-ups. This is about intentional decision-making, choices in life for people close enough to know the good news.
Yeah, it's interesting in this. It's such a short letter, and the people to whom Jude was writing were familiar with these false teachers, right? They have relationships with. There's a social connection. Yeah. So we're left to kind of try to fill in the gaps, if you will. Your original question on the difference between good news and fake news is a fascinating one, because so often we're willing to trade the good news for the fake news, and we feel that the fake news is good for us. Yeah. Right. And so that comes back to the subjective nature of what good news is like, we can say that, objectively speaking, Jesus being the hope of the world, that is good news, but it's not going to feel good for a lot of people. Yeah. And fake news feels good, right? If you're in the camp for which you have something to gain for it being fake. And so I don't know, I do want to put both of those there. That's so it's subtle, because at worst, right, these false teachers are manipulating, and they are in it for themselves and in it for what they want to experience, in it for their following, right? Yeah. And I think that's at worst how fake news is handled. At best, they are misinformed, they're trying to do good, and they're just off. Yeah. Right? And yet the damage that is done from that is can be catastrophic. And so I think that's the subtleties in which we're living, and not having, done a whole lot of study on this. I don't know, I don't know the heart. I don't know the hearts of these teachers.
Well, and that's why I love Jude, because Jude accounts for that second sense. He actually, and this is what we're looking at this coming weekend, is in verses 22 and 23, he talks about having mercy on those who doubt, save others by snatching them from the fire, to others show mercy with fear. And one of the things that I think is subtle but true of this letter is that Jude writes to the beloved. He writes about false teachers, and then he has a middle class of the others, the people who are caught between faithfulness and false false teaching. And he has compassion for them. He recognizes, like, when you're in a relationship with others, their actions, opinions, words, thoughts, decisions, they pull on us. And so he sees that what's at stake here is that, yes, some are in error, but that's having an effect on others. And so the goal for the faithful is to remain faithful themselves and to help the others find their footing again, to help them reestablish the priority of good news in their life. I think, and I suspect, that in the mind of the writer, in doing that, it brings into focus the false teacher's love of everything that's not the good news. But it puts them in a position where even they could say, wow, I'm wrong. I need to repent. This is important to me. I just remember when I was young and the idea of heresy was brought up. And this has happened so much around me. I have a hard time distinguishing if it's my experience or others. But the idea that if I know enough about Christianity that I could point to all the bad, wrong people, that becomes a motivation that I don't see present in the letter to Jude. He's able to describe by action the character of the false teachers, but in no place does he do much more than say, identify them and don't be them. Follow the good news. Commit yourself to the love of God. Be merciful to others and trust Jesus most. Yeah. That's huge. So false teaching pops up in a lot of different places in Scripture.
Well, and heresy is an interesting thing. Like, I think labels are helpful, but when labels, over time, they're used in ways that are not helpful. Yeah. So, like, throughout the New Testament, right, when you throw the word heresy here or there, like, that's loaded for emotion with us. It's like, oh, you're making a value statement about that person, not just in what they think, but in who they are. Yeah. It's used in the same way that, here we go, political again, that, like, liberals or conservatives are used, right? Like, at their best sense, they're actually really helpful handles, and yet they just get used and abused in ways that, even when we think about heresy, like the first century world, as they're trying to figure out Christianity, it was really important to identify what was Christian and what wasn't Christian.
Right. And what was the definition? Well, it really consistently was good news. I think, in inheriting the traditions, I do think we have a tendency to want to do good news and all the subpoints that we've understood following that. Yeah. But you'll see through the centuries, anytime fake news about Jesus popped up, it got talked about. So the idea, like Pelagius, the idea that Jesus was going to inspire us out of our sin. Well, they talked about that. And at the time, it was just a relevant conversation. It wasn't, let's figure out who the heretic is. It was, let's figure out what the good news remains and continues to be.
Or even one of the biggest, right? Like, the role of the person of Jesus. Was he?
That's right.
Well, I mean, Colossians talks about him being firstborn of all creation. Like, if you take that to its natural conclusion, well, if you're firstborn, then you weren't pre-exist. Like, now you're creating this hierarchy there, and so they talked about it and they figured it out, and they had councils, and that's where we get all the creeds from.
Which makes me wonder, like, we have all of the things, and we studied these, like in Bible college, seminary. In a good church is going to be aware of all of the creedal definitions. But what are the questions in our day? Like, where are the places where the good news is being not delivered clearly? where are the places that we are tempted to not like sit in the good news fully? Those are things that we really should be wrestling with and talking about. And I would point that out, that any worthwhile explanation of the good news usually sits in deep wrestling and dialogue. And there's questioning, and there's
and how we handle it.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not like a 2-sentence thing that, like, we have a statement of beliefs on our website, which we should. We should be forward about that.
Yep.
But like, my hope in that is that it leads people to deeper questions, that leads them to eventual affirmation of those statements, but with a deep understanding, because they've wrestled with, what is this good news of Jesus? How far does it run? I did want to point out, and I'm noticing time, a few things that Jude writes about the false teachers. He says, verse 5, I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Jude switches into some things that are very well known by his readers in the Old Testament and some extra canonical works. He uses those.
Yeah, you might read that verse and be like, wait, Jesus was in the Old Testament? Wait, what?
I thought Moses was there.
Yeah.
There's a lot that he does that's familiar to his readers. What he does, though, is he makes the point in those references that what we see in the Old Testament, what we see in the extra canonical writings that he quotes here, is people who are close enough to the work of God to be faithful to it, and yet chose to ignore it, challenge it, fight against it, or try to use the opportunity of it for their own way or gain or immorality. And so he points to those examples saying, listen, we know that when one encounters God, like a humble response is best. Now, next time in our deep dive, I want to spend some time on those references and point to those. But we won't have time to do that today. So Jude's not the only one who mentions false teaching, and not the only one who deals with it. And I wanted to point to a few places. 3 John, verses 9 through 10. John has a personal interaction, a consistent interaction with somebody that he names as pushing against the good news by both their actions and their words. 2 John has the same flavor. 1 John, especially chapter 2, talks about those who deny Christ being antichrists, and those who leave the community of good news believers prove that they aren't part of the community of good news believers. All of this goes all the way back to Jesus, standing in the Sermon on the Mount saying, beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but a diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and burned. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, didn't we prophesy in your name, cast out demons, and do mighty works? And I will declare to them, I didn't know you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Even for Jesus, the idea that he's bringing the good news of the kingdom should bring people into living as citizens of the kingdom. That there's not a knowing of the gospel that doesn't affect the living of life. And there's a tension there, because again, none of us gets it perfect, but I do think it raises questions in our day. Like, what does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to name Christ or the faith? And this is a dangerous line. I would say, one place we can take this question is into the public square. There is credibility to be gained by naming oneself as a Christian. Claiming evangelicalism is a hot topic in political conversations.
Well, it's the Twitter sphere in general.
Claiming Christian faith as a celebrity can get you a certain kind of of access. And I'm not saying claiming in a false sense. I'm saying truly saying, this is who I am, an identity statement. And yet, the question really ought to be is, are they carrying the good news into the world? Because any change from the good news is fake news.
Yeah.
But we can't just look across the fence, because people who are in the public sphere are a little bit easy to throw stones at. What about us? You know, I think a relevant question is, why do we go to church? Is it because we believe the good news is really true and we're there to perpetuate it and celebrate it? Or do we think there's something else that we gain? Is it a social experience that we crave or that we think is expected of us? Does it give us access to people that we want access to, instead of, does it become about us, which is kind of a hallmark of false teaching, is leveraging the good news for one's own benefit rather than carrying it forward into our own lives and into the world? So,
yeah, well, I do think that's an interesting point there, Dan. That as you're talking, as we're reading, like, my first impulse is, okay, well, as somebody who does some teaching, right, who believes certain things about, like, we all want that the brand or the version of the good news that we believe to be the good news, and that anything else outside of that is, well, they're the false teacher. But, like, I mean, Scripture really, for teachers, says, like, hey, we have to watch ourselves. We have to watch our doctrine.
Right.
That's why Paul, when he's talking in 1 Timothy, he's saying, hey, watch your doctrine closely.
Doesn't he say watch your doctrine and your lives?
Yeah. Both of them. Because the two go hand in hand. I think, we only have a couple minutes left. Last night, right, was the Oscars, and you had the situation where Chris Rock, who's one of the presenters, makes a joke about or involving Will Smith's wife, and he takes some offense to that. He actually walks up on stage and smacks Chris Rock on national television and walks off, and then yells some stuff at him. And anyway, we could spend an hour just on that alone. It was kind of, you're sitting there, it's like, whoa, this is wild. But in his acceptance speech, because later at the night, Will Smith he won the Best Actor award, which is one of the last, like, 3 awards that's the one, right? And he is essentially defending his actions a little bit, saying that he has a calling from God to protect his family, and he is going to be incredibly vigilant in doing that. And so all over social media today, you're seeing different people take hot takes on that, like, yeah, he did it, yes, that's right. And then others are like, he had no business doing that. And the space is probably like, hey, in between somewhere. And but even in that, it's like, okay, well, I don't know you, so I don't know when you say that you have a calling from God to do that. Like, I would say I have a calling from God to protect my family. Now, I don't know if that calling from God would require me to stand up on national television and go and smack somebody. But I do think it's not irrelevant that the way we live and the good news which we proclaim, they go together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, hey, we only have a couple seconds until this thing's going to kick us off. So, Dan, I'm excited for the next couple weeks of conversation as we continue in our study of the New Testament letter of Jude. All the resources you can find on our website, calvary.church/Jude1 or calvary.church/resources. We look forward to connecting with you again next week. If you have any questions, make sure email podcast@calvary.church, and we will answer those in future episodes. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.